left our heroes, we talked about whether transition, social transition, just social transition, shapes transgender children and young people's gender identity. We find that it does not. Gender identity, at least for these children, is born and not made. Let's take a look at our next question. Given that, does support for the transgender community make more transgender adolescents, right? Does the fact, okay, fine. So transition doesn't shape gender identity. It doesn't shape preferences. It doesn't make you more male or female. But does the support for the transgender community, like the social and public and familial support, we've got a slightly more inclusive social environment in the modern Western world, arguably. Does that support change how people identify? Is it creating a context in which more transgender adolescents are made? Now, we're not saying, this isn't a question about whether more are coming forward. For sure, more are coming forward. But the argument is that the question is, are more coming forward because we've made more trans, or are more coming forward because less feel the need to hide? Two very distinct questions, equally important. Let's take a look at some answers. Now, the driver for this question comes from a particular study by a researcher called Lisa Littman. Dr. Lisa Littman produced this really interesting and what ended up being quite controversial. I don't think Lisa Littman intended it for it to be that controversial, but she produced this piece of research looking at the experiences of parents of transgender adolescents in critical spheres where parents are a bit more critical of what's going on. And Lisa Littman basically said this: rapid onset gender dysphoria. She essentially, what she basically did was ask parents about these experiences, and she found within this kind of fairly critical sphere, right, identified from forums online, that these critical parents found that their adolescents had maybe I'd come to a sort of later gender knowledge. Now, gender knowledge simply means a recognition of one's gender identity as it is, right? So let's say that you're a transgender girl and you grow up in a particular environment and you hide your identity from yourself and from everyone around you until you hit adolescence, and then it sort of puberty forces it forward because, you feel like a girl on the inside and your body is masculinizing. So puberty is a good time. If it comes to you late, it's a good time for it to come. It can come later than that, this kind of gender knowledge. But the age at which you come to recognize your gender identity as outside of the norm or as different from what it was assigned at birth, from your gender assigned at birth, that's called gender knowledge, basically. Lisa Littman said there's this group of young people who are coming to this knowledge in adolescence. And maybe these young people have been influenced by the social environment rather than being truly transgender. And she said this: rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is how she described this putative phenomenon, right? This phenomenon that is distinct from discretely transgender experiences, maybe influenced more socially, maybe not genuinely transgender. She said rapid onset gender dysphoria describes a phenomena where the development of gender dysphoria is observed to begin suddenly during or after puberty in an adolescent or young adult who would not have met the criteria for gender dysphoria in childhood. ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria, appears to represent an entity that is distinct from the gender dysphoria observed in individuals who have previously been described as transgender. So this is important stuff, right? Let's say that we have this group of adolescents, vulnerable adolescents, influenced by the social environment and by families who are more supportive and friends who are more supportive and a culture that's more supportive, like developing gender dysphoria, thinking they're trans when they actually aren't. Now, we have the wonderful, the sort of incredible fortune of having somebody like Professor Greta Bauer working in this field, another of my personal heroes, having read this piece of research. Beautiful. Greta Bauer basically said, okay, well, let's take this question seriously and let's take a look at the age at which children acquire their gender knowledge and see if children, young people who acquire their gender knowledge in adolescence are distinct from people who acquire their gender knowledge at younger ages. Do they have more supportive families? Are they in more supportive environments? Do they have more gender supportive friends? And they find the following. We did not find support within a clinical population for new etiologic phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria. They did not find support within their population for a new phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria during adolescence. Among the 173 adolescents under age 16 seen in specialized gender clinics, associations between more recent gender knowledge and factors hypothesized to be involved in ROGD were either not statistically significant or were in the opposite direction to what would be hypothesized. Controlling for age and sex assigned at birth, recent gender knowledge was not significantly associated with depressive symptoms, psychological distress, past diagnoses of mental health issues, or neurodevelopmental disorders. Important because there was a sort of hypothesis that rapid onset gender dysphoria might happen in particularly neurodivergent populations. Gender dysphoria symptoms, self-harm, past year suicide attempts, having supportive online friends, general support from online friends or transgender friends, or gender support from parents. Recent gender knowledge was associated with lower scores on anxiety, severity, and impairment, probably because being openly trans in the world makes you quite anxious. For all the reasons we've described, right? Being openly trans in the world in a not so accepting world is problematic for a bunch of reasons. So, Greta Bauer finds that rapid onset gender dysphoria is probably not a real thing, that young people develop their gender knowledge at different ages for multiple reasons, but it is not because they are more vulnerable, and it is not because they have more transgender friends, and it's not because they have more gender support from parents or friends. None of that seems to be important in the age at which they acquire their gender knowledge. What's interesting here is that even if we were to consider that gender knowledge was shaped by experience to some degree, right? Even if we were to consider that to be the case, Professor Kirsten Sandberg, who was Supreme Court Justice in Norway, now an elected member of the UN Committee for the Rights of the Child, and Professor Carrie Pykter, two separate women working in very separate places, writing in very separate ways. Carrie Pykter's in Nottingham. They write about similarly about this issue of even if gender knowledge was shaped by experience, which it doesn't seem to be, but even if it were, surely our job as defenders of the rights of the child, our job is to make sure that children have all the experience that they need to find a gender that's right for them. Surely. Children, as Kirsten Sandberg writes, have a right to non-discrimination, to identity, and to health. And especially, they have a right to be heard in proceedings that affect them. And she argues that trans and intersex children, it's a bit of a medical terminology, children with differences of sexual development, should have parallel treatment, i.e. we should consider that all kind of assignment of gender at birth should be, to some degree, kind of provisional. And Carrie Pykter crystallizes that. She says a major implication of the requirement to respect a child's identity is that for all children, attribution at birth should have some level of provisionality. Even for non-intersex children, apologies for slightly medicalized terminology, basing a gender label on the child's bodily form is still really only a best guess attribution, as we do not know at this point for which children that will turn out to be inappropriate. So, gender identity, gender knowledge, doesn't seem to be shaped by experience, either by one's own experience of transition or by one's experience of support in the local community or from the people around them. And even if it were, maybe we'd have a responsibility to defend their right to find a gender that's right for them. Because who else is better to tell us what gender is right for them than them? They have a right to affect the proceedings that affect them, even as children and young people in the world. When we come back, we tackle the next of our very challenging questions, and we find answers that might give us a good understanding of a way forward, particularly when it comes to the question of affirmative care. Is affirmative care reasonable? Does it have negative outcomes or positive outcomes? We'll find out in the next video. Look forward to seeing you then.